When you read the part about me being a lawyer, I'm reminded of when Marion G. Romney was called to be in the quorum of the 12 apostles. He had practiced law for 20 some odd years, and he stood up and he spoke in general conference, and he said, I've been a lawyer for 20 years, and now I get to spend the rest of my life repenting. So I've been doing the same for a good number of years. Tonight, Sister Vaughn asked me to come and talk about my two books, and so since I accepted her invitation, I also I'm required to go back to Washington, D.C. tonight, so I'm going to cut this a little bit shorter than I normally would. So I'm going to talk probably about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have about a good half an hour or so to take questions and answer questions, and hopefully have a little discussion. And then I got to bolt out here right at 8, or else I'll miss my flight. And if I miss my flight, well, then that's not the worst thing in the world. I get to stay home with my wife and my last daughter. From the fall of Rome, from the time of the fall of Rome until Runnymede, people lived under the thumb of tyrants and despots. And then from about 1215 forward, ostensibly, at least the British monarch was brought to heel under the rule of law, but he still, and with an oligarchical type of idea, they still kept people down and kept them under their thumb. And in 1607, that was when the first permanent colony in the Americas came, and that marshy, swampy land down there in Jamestown. And from that point forward, it took another 180 years before the American colonists finally kicked off the yoke of the British and established ultimately the American Constitution. And some would say that we didn't finally get that done until 1815, when we defeated the British in the War of 1812. But nonetheless, some interesting things happened along the way. If you recall, the time of the great apostasy was essentially all of that post-Roman era. All of that was the time of the apostasy and then the Reformation. And so, but the framers recognized the idea that, contrary to even Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, you remember, and he was talking in the early 1600s, and he was talking about this idea that mankind is incapable of self-governance. So there must be this Leviathan, this centralized government that controls essentially every aspect of life. And it was very Platonic, very much like Plato. Aristotle's a little bit different. He believed people could self-govern. And then John Locke also came along about 40 years after Thomas Hobbes, and he bought into this idea of self-governance as well. And the founders were highly influenced by John Locke. They were highly influenced by Anglo-Saxon history. They were highly influenced by biblical history. And so they came up with this idea, and in 1787 was the birth of our Constitution, going forward in the Constitutional Convention, and the ratification, and then James Madison, elected to the first Congress. What did he work on? He said he promised that they would work on the Bill of Rights, and that was probably the last time a politician ever kept a promise, at least in this country. And so they did work on it. They got the Bill of Rights, and how did they do that? Did they wait? Because you have to realize that there were over 100 proposals for amendments to the Constitution, and several states said we're going to do a conditional approval of conditional ratification of the Constitution if there is a Bill of Rights. And the founders fought, argued against that, and finally they got a bunch of non-conditional ratifications, but they promised we'll do a Bill of Rights. And so key to that in the First Amendment is the recognition of the right of freedom of conscience, freedom to worship. And that's critical. And so why I'm just rehearsing that for you, that little history for you, is both of my books, The Con of the Con-Con and the Doctrine of Liberty, are treatments of freedom. They are treatments of freedom approaching them from different points of view. The first one, the Doctrine of Liberty, addresses what I consider to be the second great meta-theme of the Book of Mormon. And of course, the first one is the existence of a Savior, Jesus the Christ, and testimony of Him. I believe the second meta-theme is this very idea of the doctrine of liberty. And so my book treats that from a perspective of the way we would look at as LDS for a plan of salvation. So in a premortal existence, immortality, and then in the post-mortal existence, which will be our eternities, we will have freedom and free will at that point. And so I wrote the book to largely explore this idea from the LDS point of view, because I think we need a bunch of Captain Moronis and a bunch of Tiankums today. I really do. So I was once on track to become a seminary teacher in the church education system. And they used to do this thing called symposium. And at symposium, what it was is you would go up to, and you'd be on BYU's campus, and you'd be there for a week, and you'd do all kinds of workshops and classes to be taught a bit about some of the curriculum. So I was only in the program long enough to go 1 year, so that tells you a little bit about me. But anyway, the year we were doing it was about the Book of Mormon, and so I took some very interesting. I won't go to all of them. There were some interesting classes, but one of the ones I went to dealt with the warring chapters of the Book of Mormon, and that's about Alma 43 to about Helaman 5 or 6, right in that whole area. And so I wanted to get this guy's particular take on that. And he basically said, look, I'm not quite sure why Mormon decided to include this when he compiled the records, because it seems like it's awfully violent. Perhaps he knew that young men in our day would be interested in wars and want to read the Book of Mormon because of that. Although I had never found that to be intriguing when I was a kid to read about the wars. And then he gave a few metaphors that you could use that he would extrapolate from, such as what did Captain Moroni do? He built up forts and made strong the weak places in the Nephite kingdom in preparation. So you could say if you're weak and you're swearing, well, let's build you up so you don't swear so much. So you fortify your weak spots. I was greatly disappointed by that, because for me, he missed out on probably what the real theme is there, and the theme of that is freedom. Why else would it be there? So that's why I wrote that book. So with that, I'm going to just deviate for one quick second and go to some scriptures. I hope you don't mind, but I was asked this question. It says in your book, The Doctrine of Liberty, on page 2, the statement I make this statement: we have a doctrinal imperative to preserve liberty. And the writer says he would like me to expand on what I mean. So I'm going to just do that real quickly. So for me, the book Doctrine of Liberty was meant to be solely derivative from the Book of Mormon. I could have gone elsewhere, and I think others have done that. They've gone to early prophets of this dispensation. They've gone to the Doctrine and Covenants. I chose to go strictly, and you could go to the book, Old and New Testament as well. I chose to go strictly from the Book of Mormon. I didn't think anybody else had ever done that. That's why I went that way. But I'm going to tell you that for me, it begins in, if I were to look in Doctrine and Covenants 134, if any of you have that, and even if you don't have it, I'm going to still go there. If I go to 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2, we believe the governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man. That's why they have government. And He, God, holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them. So the first thing that tells me is everybody here will be held accountable by your relationship to your government. And frankly, probably not much more needs to be said, but I'll go on. It says that both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society, we believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, that's worship, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. Life, liberty of conscience, and property. What does that sound like? Natural laws. Sounds like John Locke, and John Locke was adapted by Thomas Jefferson to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And then I get to verse 5. It says, we believe all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments. So we have an obligation, government has an obligation. When government fails to live up to its obligation, we also have some natural law things, but I won't get there. But to me, I could stop right there, I think, and say that is a scriptural imperative. But I go on, because that's kind of the way I am. I'm going to get rolling here. 98, section 98, and I don't want to go through all those verses. The law of the land, which is constitutional. What constitution? Is there any other constitution besides the U.S. Constitution? No. He is referring to this Constitution, I believe. Supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. So what is the title of the Constitution? Who all does it belong to? All of mankind. All of mankind. So when the founders said this is a city whose light set on a hill, when Reagan said we are a light shining on the hill, we have that obligation. We have that obligation to help perpetuate that. And when that's under attack, I think we have a moral imperative and a scriptural imperative to preserve and protect. And he goes on to say, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land, and as pertaining to law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. It's really constrained, isn't it? And then he says, I, the Lord God, make you free. You are free indeed, and the law maketh you free. Wherefore honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men should you observe to uphold. That, to me, tells us that each one of us has an imperative to be involved. We need to seek out people who will be elected, who will be good, worthy, righteous, and uphold the Constitution. You go on, and of course, D&C 101, but I won't. But I'm going to just, in interest of giving you if you were to just turn to Alma 60, any one of these chapters will do. But I thought maybe Alma 60, just pull one out. So if you go from 43 to Helaman 5, you could pull up most any chapter, and you'd find something similar to this. In this instance, Moroni is upset with Pehoran. Pehoran is the chief judge, and Captain Moroni is concerned. He says, we're not getting the support we need help. Can you give us some support? So they're writing letters back and forth, and they're discussing. And in verse 10, it says, my beloved brethren, for ye ought to be beloved, yea, and ye ought to have stirred yourselves more diligently for the welfare and the freedom of this people. And if you were to move on down, you're going to find a second, in verse 16, there's a second verse here. This is Pehoran's response, and he says, look, we've had a war amongst ourselves, we've had the kingmen fighting us and everything, and we could have been okay, we could have helped you. And midway through this 16 says, had they been true to the cause of our freedom and united with us. United in the cause of freedom. So there's two references. If you go over to verse 25, you'll see a third reference. Except ye grant mine epistle and come out and show unto me a true spirit of freedom and strive to strengthen and fortify our armies. Behold, I'm going to leave a part of the free men to maintain this part of our land, and we're going to come after you. As he goes on. In verse 27 again, he says, I will come unto you, and if there be any among you that has a desire for freedom, if there's even a spark of freedom remaining, I will stir up insurrections among you. This is Captain Moroni writing to Pehoran again. And he says, we're going to have a revolution to preserve freedom if you don't straighten up. So that's the fourth, and you get to 5. He says, I do not fear your power nor your authority. It's my God whom I fear. I take my sword to defend the cause of my country. Another reference there. In verse 30, he references again the cause of our freedom. And then for the seventh reference, he said, I am Moroni, your chief captain. I seek not for power, but to pull it down. I seek not for honor of the world, but for glory of my God and the freedom and welfare of my country. So you have these imperatives, and that's what the Doctrine of Liberty is getting at. Is that it reviews all of the freedom and also the forms of government in the Book of Mormon. I think the Book of Mormon is a very profound and deep book. It talks about virtually every kind of government that I can think of that I've studied in my time, and it also talks about the rights that this Nephite state that they refer to as a country. And by the way, in our terms, at least in terms at the time of our founding fathers and in academic circles even today, a state is what most people refer to as a country. It is a sovereign state. It's a state with authority and power, with integrity in their borders, which we don't really have anymore. But a normal sovereign does have integrity in their borders, and so they talk about that form of the state. They talk about everything from property rights, and they talk about this. And if you were to look in Alma chapter 12, there's two things that I always struggle about Alma chapter 12. Number one is that Alma takes a vacation, and so that's, if you ever need a vacation, you can justify that scripturally. And then the second thing,
I'll remember that.
The second thing is, when I was practicing law, this is what part of the things that you need to repent of, because nobody's lower than a collection law attorney. But I did this because I had a buddy who came in and said, look, he said, can you help me do some collection work? I said, I don't do that. But I went ahead and did it, and he said, look, and he was LDS, he said, I'm going to tell you, Andy, everything we're doing is scripturally based. I said, what do you mean scripturally based? And he said, well, we talked about due process, because Alma chapter 12 talks about due process. It says if somebody owes you money, you can complain to a judge. And then if the judge says that they really do owe you the money, then you can demand that they pay you. And if they don't pay you, you can seize their property. And what does that sound like? That is basically collection law 101 in this country today. But the point is, I think that the Book of Mormon is really powerful and covers a lot of these things about governance and government, and particularly freedom. And we as Latter-day Saints, and so I wrote the book because I feel like we as Latter-day Saints really have kind of put our heads in the sand. We're all busy doing genealogy and missionary work, but there's not very many of us. Probably this room looks pretty feisty for freedom, but there's not a lot of really feisty for freedom LDS folks, and we need to be. We need to be vigilant and stand up for it. And that leads me to why I wrote the next book, which is also thematic on freedom. It's the Con of the Con, and the subtitle is basically I can't remember the subtitle. The case against the states amending the U.S. Constitution. Now what that boils down to is this: there is a malaise in this country, and in this particular time, what I'm referring to is a lot of people feel like we're headed down and almost irretrievably gone in this country. We're losing freedoms. We see, for instance, the economic problems that we have where we have literally tens of trillions of dollars in liabilities that are unfunded. There's no way we can pay for those. We have a structural deficit at the federal level. We've got a president that has specifically said he doesn't care what's in the Constitution. He's going to do whatever he wants. He's going to basically enact forms of treaties that have not been ratified by Congress as required. He's going to basically rule by fiat. We've got a feckless Congress who basically says, we don't want to get in that fight, and so they talk a good game on the campaign trail, but don't get that. The point is, some people believe that things are so bad that we need to take drastic action. And their remedy, I think, is the wrong remedy. Their remedy is to use a section of the Constitution which deals with amendments, and they want to amend the Constitution. And I think that's problematic. James Madison kept pretty good notes of the Constitutional Convention. Yates from New York also took some pretty good notes for the convention. And what you'll find if you ever have read those notes, it's very intriguing because you'll see some interesting things like Alexander Hamilton, who helped form John Jay and Madison together to form the triumvirate that wrote the Federalist Papers. But Alexander Hamilton wanted to get rid of states altogether.
Yeah.
It's pretty, and he makes that clear in there. And so they have these debates going on, and it's very interesting. But they talked about amending because they all agreed that they would make errors, or there might be omissions, and there would need to be something to be corrected in the Constitution. So they devised something which later became Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, Article 5 is interesting because it provides two mechanisms to amend the Constitution. Every amendment we've ever done has occurred this way, where 2/3 of the houses of Congress have come up with a proposed amendment. They've sent it to the states have ratified. The only one that's in doubt is the 16th Amendment, but I don't want to walk down that road tonight. But the other way is if 2/3 of the states were to petition Congress, Congress is required then to issue a call for a convention, a proposing convention. And then anything that might come out of there has to go for ratification to the states again. Now I'm shortening that up. The reason I'm shortening it up is time-wise. But let me just tell you, I believe that it's very problematic for a lot of reasons. I've studied this for many years. I've had the pleasure of speaking at Harvard about this. And some of the arguments I made there, at least one of the guys who's pro-con has changed at least the structure of his mechanism based on some of the things that I talked about there, and he's trying to go. But he's still cemented in.
Is this Lessig?
No. Lessig is really concerned, though. By the way, I'm talking about Mr. Granius, actually.
Lessig and Dranius work together, so.
Well, Lessig is bought into Dranius. Anyway, so that's not why I done it. So what I do is, in this book, I explain what my concerns are, why I think it's a bad idea, and then I also take specifically the three arguments of proponents. I ignore Mark Levin, in spite of the fact that he calls me nasty names on the radio. I ignore him, and I just go to three of the big major proponents. Ferris, who does something called, what's his called?
Convention of the States.
Convention of the States. Then Nick Dranius does one called Compact of the States, or state, whatever that is.
Compact for me.
Yeah, whatever. and I work on him, and then I work on a guy named Professor Nadelson, who is and I grant he's an expert, but they all rely on some of his statements, and I try to undercut his statements. In other words, there's a portion of that I debate, but and respond to their arguments. Just a little funny aside. Nick Dranius has known that I've been writing this book for a long time, and so he called up my assistant one day and he said, "Will Biggs give me an advanced copy of the book so we can peer review his book?" And I said, those of you who know my former assistant Marcus told him, "I don't believe you ever let Biggs peer review any of your articles and any of the stuff," so we didn't give it to him. I figure if he wants to buy it, he can buy it on Amazon for $12.95 plus shipping. In any event, I deal with the con of the con. That's what it is. I wanted to just give a brief overview of both books because it would be better if we just have some dialogue and take some questions. So, any questions so far? You know, I am a politician and a former trial lawyer, so I can just talk all night. Jim.
Does the Senate have to re-vote you as president next session?
No.
Oh, good.
No. Although, which leads to a great point. Every legislative body in this country is a self-governing body. And what I mean by that is we adopt our own rules, we elect our own officers. We have to obey constitutional constraints, but other than that, we can do what we want. So what happens is, even though I'm the Senate President now and have been for 3 years, at any day that I walk down there, if there were a majority of senators who said, we think it's time for him to go, they could just,
Vote you out.
they could vote me out. That's the beauty of a self-governing system, and that's part of the beauty of ours. The reason I bring that up is because Mr. Nadelson, Professor Nadelson, acknowledges that a convention, a proposing convention, and even a convention of delegates or the legislature for ratifying is a self-governing convention. But then he says they won't change the rules.
Oh.
And I will just tell you that they change rules and can change rules. And I'll give you an example, one I mentioned in my book. You remember a couple of years ago there was a big debate on the Medicaid expansion, Obamacare expansion in Arizona. And I was opposed to it. And I was the Senate President, and there were a majority of state senators who were Republicans who opposed that, and a majority of state representatives who were Republicans who opposed it. But Governor Brewer supported it, and all the Democrats, of course, supported it. And there was a small group of Republicans in the middle on each side. Well, the governor finally got fed up with us, and so what she did is she organized two things. She organized an effort to throw me out as president, we're talking about, and throw out Andy Tobin, who was the Speaker of the House. She was trying to get rid of both of us, and she wanted her bills through that would grant Medicaid expansion. So what happened? I was called, I was going home. I got called while I'm on the freeway by my chief of staff. She's all upset. And they call me upset, but you can't believe what's happened. You got to get back here right now. They want to throw you out, and they want to do this thing. And I said, okay. So I get back down there, and what happens ultimately is they suspended all the rules by
Who is
majority
they?
vote. The coalition of the Democrats and the few Republicans who now were a majority. So now you had a coalition. They had enough votes. They were the majority of the self-governing body. And they did. They suspended all the rules. So they didn't have regular committees. So there was no public testimony. There was no. They suspended. So you didn't have to go to the Rules Committee. And normally every bill goes to the Rules Committee to determine if it's constitutional or not. They attempted to suspend debate rules on the floor. But instead of just suspending those, what they did is they just refused to debate. So because there was a sponsor on the floor, I would stand up and I would say, will so-and-so yield to a question? They would not yield to the question. My point is...
It's like court.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
You can suspend the rules, and they do suspend the rules. And so when you have a constitutional convention or a convention where you're considering amending the Constitution, just be aware that coalitions will form. I guarantee you they will form. And folks will manipulate the system like we saw and change rules. It happens all the time in parliamentary bodies that are self-governed. So, yes?
This is, I don't know the approach I assumed by constitutional amendment, but I think one of the biggest weaknesses we have in our government is the fact that we do not have term limits for Supreme Court appointees. They get up there and 4 presidents later, from the one who appointed and Congress approved, you've still got the same people on the bench. I would like to see a rotating where some of those, come up and they, that there's a term limit. And I would like to see that by amendment, because I think it would be a much better system. I really do.
Let me comment on that for a second. There's two things that
So please speak to this matter.
There's two things that I think are very, very important. I do agree with you. I think that we should limit the length of time that somebody can sit on the Supreme Court. But believe it or not, we actually have that in our U.S. Constitution today. You do not need to do anything other than elect a Congress that will enforce the term limits, because
Where in
what
the
it,
Constitution?
what does the Constitution say? Huge problems that we have in the state, and that would be, I think we need to make them, at least the Supreme Court, elected by popular vote, as opposed to this silly system that we have now, where they get appointed and then you just approve them. That's a silly system. And not only that, the chief executive officer, the governor in the state, does not get to appoint those who he thinks are the best qualified. He's provided a list that has been screened by a committee, and the chair of that committee is who? It is typically, although ex officio, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, who I guarantee you, because I've heard from folks who sit on those panels, the second that the Chief Justice walks in and sits down, they control that committee, and everybody does whatever they want. And so it seems to me we probably need to do something there as well. But that's a fair point.
How do we get to the point of doing? That's my question. What
Well-
is the methodology? I mean, we can sit here forever and debate that, and everyone say, yeah, because we really are so removed from the legal process. Same thing with trial by jury. There is so much decision-making regarding our lives, and it's a very few people that have opportunity to pass a decision that affects us at all levels.
Yeah.
And it needs to be addressed. I think it would do more for this country, state level or national. We
Well,
need it.
there-
Now, how do we get it?
Again, you actually have the mechanism. But you have to change who we elect. And groups like this is how you begin to affect who we elect. We did not get where we are now overnight. This ship of state has actually been going, and we've actually been turning around. A lot of people don't believe that, but I'm going to give you an example, and because I think the solution is you elect better people. That's the solution to everything. I actually had a pro-con person tell me, we've tried that for 80 years, that hasn't worked. And I said, well, I'm going to give you an example of where it has worked, and I'd like to give you an example tonight. In 1976, the Republican Party was in deep trouble. Richard Nixon had been forced to resign. Previous to that, his vice president had resigned. Gerald Ford had ascended from Speaker of the House to vice president to president. Ronald Reagan was running. He was extremely popular, but he couldn't quite get over the hump at that convention because of the elite, in my opinion. The elite kind of rigged that up. On the other side, Jimmy Carter. How quickly we forget Jimmy Carter.
Gave away our canal.
How quickly we'd like to forget Jimmy Carter. But anyway, Jimmy Carter ended up winning that election. And how was he received by the American public? Well, he was a great guy. He created the misery index, if you recall. How miserable are you? Well, you're really miserable under me. That's right. So now Ronald Reagan took the momentum that he had in '76, brought it together, and he won overwhelmingly. And we had a new president in town, and he was, in my opinion, a transformational president. So there's not a lot of transformational presidents, but this guy was a transformational president. And why do we know? Because if you were a conservative in 1978, what was it like? Those of you who've been around, it was, you were persecuted if you were conservative, were you not? Well, I know we were. I had a car parked on the side of my parents' house, and every time my mother would write a letter to the editor that was conservative in nature, that they'd either steal my battery out of my car, they'd write swear words on it, they'd egg my house, our house, and my car, whatever. I went to law school in Tucson. Not really a conservative town. And if you were conservative, you just ducked your head down to get through. And there was a poor guy, he was a biology major, and he said one time we were studying Roe v. Wade, he said, yeah, you know, all that legal mumbo jumbo is great, but, you know, biologically speaking, at conception, it is a human life, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they literally, through wadded up papers and throwing them at them. They were booing, and our professor just stood there. You couldn't even do that free speech down there. It was an impossible time. But Ronald Reagan was transformation. And how did he get there? Because the American people can be trusted when they are educated. They want freedom. They understand freedom. And we can elect a Congress that will do the right things, such as impeach judges. But let me tell you what happens. It's a weird thing. Who can tell me who the last federal judge to be impeached was? I know. Anybody else know? I'll give you a hint. He was a judge down in Palm Beach, Florida, the same voting district that had the hanging chads, right? His name was Alcee Hastings. Alcee Hastings was impeached. Now, and guess what his job is today?
Probably a lobbyist.
No.
A government.
Look, if you think he's a lobbyist, you're not cynical enough. If you were to walk down to Congressman Matt Salmon's office in the Rayburn building, just down the hall somewhere, it's like a mousetrap. So somewhere around the corner, you can go and you can see the congressional office of Alcee Hastings, who, after being impeached as a federal judge, was elected by that same Palm Springs district that had the hanging chads and couldn't figure out, those people didn't know how to vote. They elected him to be a congressman. Now, that kind of undercuts my argument a little bit about, trusting the people. But I still, despite of that, I still trust the people. I still trust the people.
If they have the knowledge.
Yeah, if they have knowledge, and that's the point. Yeah, we educate them and we turn it around. And the reason I'm telling you this whole story is, today, most people running for office, and I don't care if your name's Kirsten Sinema, you run as a conservative. You do because America is a right center populace. We still lean to the right. Most people, even though we have 50% plus of our people receive some kind of direct benefit from the federal government, even though most people want a reduced size of government. They really do. But we have got to convey the message, and you know what's helping us is the nasty establishment media is shrinking, and what's happening now is people are talking word to mouth, mouth to ear, and conveying these things that are working. So I believe in that. We can still do it, and that's how you get there. That's how you actually limit judges, and you need to get rid of judges who aren't good behavior. Let me give you an example. Why in the world wouldn't there be an impeachment proceeding on a federal judge who's relying on international law or some foreign state's law instead of American law? They should be gone. They should not be sitting on a bench. Anyway.
Nancy, I'd like to see a bill go through, and just to let the audience know here, if you have an idea, you need to go to your legislator and see if they'll run the bill, if they like it, or find a legislator that might like it. But I'd like to see one that everybody who runs for office must pass a Constitution test in order to run. Now, exactly how you would enforce that, I don't know. But
We have the civics test now.
Yeah.
Yes, that.
The civics test is, with all due respect,
It's pretty weak.
it is very weak and very, very easy. There is no, if you can't pass the civics test, there's a problem. I've asked that question. We've talked it with our lawyers, and they believe that would have to be a constitutional change. And so it would be, because you're talking about qualification to serve.
Yeah.
Which is a constitutional issue. That would have to go to the vote of the people.
Might be a good time to do that with the.
Might be, but it would have to be written by.
Very cleverly written.
It'd have to be written correctly. And the reason I say that is, there's a group, and I won't say their name because you're recording me, but there's a group that teaches Constitution classes and runs national contests about the Constitution. I've acted as their judge before. They're very good, and they teach these kids very, very well, but they teach them there's a bent and a bias in how they teach it, I believe. And so I've actually had wonderful debates with some of these high school kids who are very, very knowledgeable, but they've been taught and coached in a certain way, and they're basing things on case law as opposed to original intent or original understanding of the Constitution. That's a problem.
Back to the CON-CON, how do we get the legislators, our legislators, the crowd that falls into the we have to do something crowd, how do we get them to understand that they can do something and should be doing something called nullification? And oh, by the way, that means you can't accept the money.
Yeah.
That's a terrific question, because I make the same argument with my friends down there all the time. Because that's really, to be honest with you, this idea for a constitutional amendment is, in my opinion, if you listen to most of it, it boils down to, and I kind of summarize this in the book, most of them say, are just, well, we got to do something.
Right.
Well, these guys are the same guys that if you say, well, why don't we tell the federal government, we're not going to allow you to shut down Navajo generating station.
Mm-hmm.
The scientific data that is that we have in support of keeping that open is overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
The sole purpose that the EPA is giving is that there's some derogation in visibility over the Grand Canyon. And you can take a before picture and an after picture adjusted for whatever it is, and it is indiscernible.
It's due to dust anyways, and forest fires from California.
Yeah,
not even due to us.
it's not us. It's not us. It's coming from elsewhere. But the point is, you have to have we have to elect a governor. Here's why you don't do a CON-CON anyway, because these same people are left to ratify these things.
Mm-hmm.
You have to elect people who will say, like when I ran a bill 4 years ago that said we're gonna no longer participate in the federal Medicaid program. We're just not going to do it. That cost was at the time over $3.2 billion a year. We drew down $6.5 billion of federal dollars that they don't have, by the way. They're just writing these checks out of air. $3.2 billion. We served at the time over 1 million people in Arizona. We had more people on Medicaid than we have in our K-12 system, than we have kids in K-12 system. So I ran this bill, and we got it out of the appropriations committee, and then that president at the time said, he said, I don't think you have it, so we're not going to hear it on the floor. I had devised a way that we take that $3.2 billion, you could use $2.2 billion of that and pay for the sickest of the sick, the truly indigent people, and make sure that they had coverage. So I wasn't even getting out of the socialized medicine business. And the other $1 billion, you could take half of that for our transportation infrastructure, which badly needs it, and the other half would go to education, to be permanent funding. Well, the only reason I got it out of the appropriations committee is because I'm the appropriations committee chairman. And everybody else wanted their bills out. So they said, well, if we vote for this bill, then this might let my bill come through. So then we couldn't get it on the floor because nobody wanted to touch it. Because everybody who's getting money in that system, the hospital associations, the medical care providers, the behavioral health providers, all of them said, we're against this. And that's the way it works. And so we have to elect people who are willing to, so when you say nullification, I don't call it nullification because that's a loaded term, but what I call it is fighting back. You have to fight back. I tried to run a bill, just so you know, on federal gas tax. We are a donor state. We get about 90 cents back out of every dollar of gas tax that we send, we get back here. We should get all of it. Why should they, who's scraping off 10 cents of our dollars? Well, Alaska was getting like $2.12 for every dollar at the time. So I said, look, we're going to run a bill where we keep all federal gas taxes in Arizona. We're just going to keep them here. And I found out it's pretty clever. The feds don't charge it at the pump. If they did, we could, since that money gets rebated into remitted to the state Department of Revenue, we could just keep it. They collect it at the refineries. And who knows how many refineries we have in Arizona?
Probably zero.
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 We have no refineries. There's no-
Yeah.
So they collect that tax from the pipelines and from the refineries, and so we couldn't even not pay that tax and keep it here in the state. But we've got to kick back. The current nationalization effort on education is nothing more than a nationalization effort, federalization to nationalize education. We've got to say no. And so my point is, yeah, we are, Jennifer, good job, but we are trying to say no over and over and over again. It's one of the reasons I think it's so dangerous to do a constitutional convention, because the ratification is going to be done from the same people. I can't get to do what I consider very simple things to say no to. How about the Mexican gray wolf? Why are we bowing to the EPA, or not EPA, the Department of
Species.
whatever they
Interior.
are?
Wildlife.
Yeah, Fish and Wildlife.
Fish and wildlife.
They're bringing us in.
They're taking them all over
They're
and relocating.
going to, they already do kill some cattle, and instead of letting our cowmen just shoot them and kill them, they're going to have to ask for reparations. So the whole thing is, you're going to bring a wolf in, it's going to kill the cow. The cowman's got to go through, and he's going to take a year and a half going through the red tape to get his money to pay for that cow. This is the type of thing we're up against. We got to stop.
Do you
And
provide
this-
an estimate
No.
on currently?
Come on, Andy.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I don't know all the in-depth of what's going on.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. No,
You have to live the legislature like
Yeah.
the rest of us.
So, any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the scriptural interpretation. And it seems like, looking at the Constitutional Convention and all of that as well, that I don't know that the Book of Mormon is necessarily, or any of the scriptures, teaching us that democracy is the best form of government. I'm pretty sure I know that Tanner is called the Church of Theocracy, and that's a better form of government. And so, you mentioned earlier that Captain Moroni was willing to cause revolution against the government which he thought was good in order to preserve freedom.
Right.
And we have a 200-year track history of being incapable of electing officials that will do the right thing. And so, what if the Book of Mormon is really trying to show us how even democratic governments fail, and we need to be ready to revolt, just like Thomas Jefferson suggests. And that's why the article is even in the Constitution to begin with.
Great question. So I'm gonna answer it in my own way. The first way I would answer it is, the Book of Mormon is actually pretty clear on this, and they say King Benjamin, who gives the kingship to his son King Uzziah, and King Uzziah is the one who turns his government over from a monarchy to a representative form of government, which is the reign of judges. And if you study that, you see it's really a Republican type, a law Republican type. Mosiah says, look, the best form of government, if you could always have a good, righteous man to be your king, would be a monarch. But he says it's highly unlikely to happen. I think that Captain Moroni, and he lived under the reign of judges, a Republican form of government. We don't really live under democracy. I know people think that I'm splitting hairs, but we really don't. Arizona a little bit more so than most states because we have such an easy initiative process. But we live in a republic, a representative republic. I just go by what we just read in Doctrines of Liberty that said, look, anything more or less than this constitutional form of government is evil. Article 5 is there. I do believe that it's fine to use Article 5. I just don't think this is the time to use Article 5. And people will say, why don't you think it's the time? Well, because I just heard a recent speaker last Saturday night talk about what was it like. He said, this guy's not a really religious guy, but he said, if you were, you'd have to believe it was a miracle. At the founding of this country, this little strip of basically land carved out of a wilderness, almost a Neanderthal type setting when the colonists first got here. They built it up. They had, these people came, they were largely united in their political perspective, having come from the idea of freedom that Anglo-Saxons had established and was carried through Great Britain. But they came and you had this unique group of men get together to write the Constitution. Scholars, political scholars, people like James Madison who had studied virtually every form of government, but he wasn't the only one, whether it's James Wilson or Roger Sherman. They all had studied, they were all knowledgeable. And today, I just think, as rough as the situation was where they were there then, it would be really next to impossible to put together, first of all, that many qualified people. Second of all, it wouldn't be private like it did at the time. They actually shut it off, and it was absolutely totally private. So where these guys, they didn't have to deal with what the public was saying on a daily basis. And I'll just tell you that I can have a close meeting with a half a dozen members of the Senate, and they're all tweeting out while I'm talking to them in a meeting that's supposed to be top secret. So just so we can just talk about it. You cannot have open and unfettered dialogue. Do you think I'm guarded with what I tell them? You better believe it. Do you think Alexander Hamilton, if he knew that James Madison or Lansing or Yates from New York were going to be tweeting out that Hamilton, our other delegate from New York, since Hamilton, Lansing and Yates were the delegates from New York, if the two of them were tweeting out Hamilton wants to eliminate states and go to a pure monarchy, well, Hamilton never would have said that. You can't have the unfettered dialogue that those guys were able to have. It was, as James Madison said, the most propitious of circumstances. And we don't have that today. So I don't think that, for me, I don't see it as a message that we should rise up and revolt. At least not yet. You got to delete that, Tom.
Shouldn't it be a revolution of words, of education,
Well,
that kind of a revolution?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the founders, some of the founders have said, and even some of the pro-con kind of guys that have been in my office, believe me, I get them all in my office. They all come in to yell at me. They admit we can have a bloodless revolution every 2 years, and I believe that. You can have a bloodless revolution every 2 years. I know people say, I don't believe that. I'm just telling you, we had a tidal wave change last November. We didn't have the head of the tidal change of the wave. The fact that we kept John Boehner as our leader and Mitch McConnell, that's a mistake. That's a mistake, and the people that voted for him should be held accountable. But you take a look at that tidal wave change, and they're able to kind of notify Obama a little bit. They could do more. If they had the courage to do more, they could do more. But we did have a tidal wave change.
You had mentioned a couple times, Andy, the Lord's statement in the 98th section of the Doctrine and Covenants that anything more or less than this cometh of evil. Well, the Lord, of course, was referencing the Constitution. He was establishing the Constitution as what? As a standard that could be used by people to measure propositions, candidates. The list goes on.
Oh, absolutely.
And what can be a very simple standard. But I find it interesting, though, that there was an Arizona state legislator who met with an official of the people that have been blessed with this gospel doctrine, this information. And that official asked the Arizona state legislator, what can we do? And that legislator made an observation that don't tell these people to go to the polls because they'll probably make mistakes. They haven't been educated. They don't understand. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a fair statement. I've made similar statements since then, and I've actually told individuals that have been sitting across from me, I've said, as we've discussed things, I've said, I hope you never vote.
Yeah.
I hope you never vote because you are ignorant of what the facts are and what our rights are. So what I think my obligation is to do which is why I wrote the books, is I'm trying to educate people. And people can disagree with me. I'm comfortable with that. They can disagree with me and my positions. But my point is, I am trying to educate people. I'm trying to beg, implore LDS people in particular. But just so you know, if you're not a member of the LDS Church, politicians think that we vote as well. Some organized monolithic bloc.
That's why Janet Napolitano was elected, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And who was the alternative?
Right.
One of our own,
One
so
of
to
our own.
speak.
Yeah, the point is, I don't believe we're monolithic, nor do we participate. That election taught me something, because I saw exit polling, which when you do exit polling, you see people self-identify in areas that you want them to poll. And so we wanted to know, how are the LDS people turning out?
Oh.
They didn't turn out as well as the rest of the population, and they certainly didn't vote for Matt Sam as much as we would have thought they would.
They didn't vote for Russell.
Yeah, they didn't vote for Russell. Just the point is, we are not a monolithic voting bloc,
And we're not educated.
and we're not educated, which is why I applaud you for holding this and the other meetings. I know several others of you do work on blogs and other ways to try to educate as well. That's what we have to do. We have to keep dropping pebbles in the pond and send the ripples out to educate and talk. And if we do that, I think that we can end up turning it around. I think we are turning it around slowly but surely. But I mean, that last election was a rejection. It was a rejection. 2010, Obama said, if you vote against me, you're rejecting me. Well, he learned his lesson since he was rejected in 2010. What he said in 2014 is, if you vote for Republicans, you are rejecting my policies. Overwhelmingly, the American people rejected Obama's policies. If our leaders in Congress would read correctly, we would see a sea change. We would see that revolution. Because the people voted that way. They said, we don't like these policies. We don't like a president who says, I'm going to do whatever I want. We want a lawful president, and we want to turn it around. And I think that's the mass that we have from the people. Now the media is doing all they can to stigmatize and demonize this, but I still think that I mean, those of you who are fighting, for instance, in the Common Core issue, I think that the Arizona voters gave a crystal clear message on
Yes,
that.
they did.
And they
And
still
yet-
are.
And they still are. The polling data is pretty clear. But we have, for whatever they,
Traitors.
some of these people just won't acknowledge that. And I told, last fall I had a meeting with the Arizona Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. They have all kinds of stuff on the board. And so I'm sitting there, and they're all there, and this is my last story because then I gotta go. But the guy says to me, after I give him my little presentation on what's going on in the budget and all this stuff like that, the guy says to me, hey, what do you think is going to be the deal with Common Core? Diane Douglas had not won yet. And I said, I'm going to tell you something. Common Core is over. The voters do not want it. You guys who profess to be the business community and think you know what everybody wants, I'm looking around, every one of you are as an executive with some of the largest companies in Arizona. The average mom and pop either doesn't care or they do not want Common Core. You are not speaking for the people. You are speaking for the money. And so you need to stop it, stand down. We can do alternative standards. They'll be our standards. We can do it without the connection and control of Washington, D.C. Why wouldn't you want that? And they all just sat there quiet. And I say stuff to them like that because I'm going to save this for the time to get rid of me, and I can just say whatever I want to those guys. But somebody has got to tell them.
Yeah.
Why don't they want it? I mean, I understand why I don't, but why don't people in general want Common Core? A lot of people do. Tell me why they don't want
I
it.
think for me, it is because you are under the thumb of Washington, D.C. If I were to go back and give you the history of this began with No Child Left Behind, which was a gross federal program under.
George W.
Under George W. And then Race to the Top was a way for Obama to try to buy off the chief of staff of Governor Brewer at the time. Was, please do not apply for Race to the Top funds. First of all, if we get it, we're not going to get much money, which, by the way, we didn't get much money.
25 million.
Yeah, we got $25 million, but we, as part of it, we signed a contract saying we will basically submit to federal standards and assessments.
Full of hot.
That's crazy. That's crazy. There was no authority for that. But they did. And so people who think we should do it, they want it. And I will say this, I think if you take the cynicism in me out, I think everybody just wants the best educational system they can get. But why they think a very, and Jenna can tell you more about it, and I don't want to get into it, so after I go, you guys can talk about it. Why they think that has to be designed by people who are funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, I don't know.
2.5 billion.
I don't know. Why not let us do it in our state? And I actually ran a bill 2 years ago, which I still think is the solution, and that is this. You let every local district or charter set their own standards.
Yes.
And what you do is you, for their assessment, you say you just have to have a cross-blocked national norm reference test. Why? Because we would know. We would know what it is. They claim they want to know how is Arizona doing vis-a-vis California and Texas or whatever. Well, if you do a national norm reference test and crosswalk it, you'll know. But everybody else can set their curriculum, they can do their standards. And if you've got a lousy district, the parents can come in and say, you know what, our district's lousy. We got to get rid of our board. We need to get rid of our superintendent or whatever they need to do. And if you've got a great board and superintendent and a great district, you say, we love what they're doing. Why not let the parents and the locals have control? That's all I was trying to get at, and my bill went down in a heap of flames.
Well, we had a meeting with the governor today, talking about the standards review committee that's being set up. And it was full, the whole room was full of moms. So we had a meeting today, and that process is going forward. It was a very good meeting and very eye-opening for the governor on many issues. So we're making progress.
Well, I'm glad you're there. I'm glad. I know that all of you are fighting in one way or another, and I appreciate it. And I hate to leave you so soon. And Cindy, my lovely wife, will stay here and help out in any way that she can. Thanks for what you're doing, because we have got to stand. And I will tell you one other thing. The reason, ultimately, the reason people don't stand is, have you ever? Okay, so I'm going to liken it to Lynn Swann, who was a famous wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And maybe it was a Marcus Shire, one of the two. He said, running across the middle to catch a pass from a quarterback is like running into a cement mixer coming the other way at 60 miles an hour and trying to catch the ball where you're doing. That's what going out in the public sphere and taking a stand for what you believe in can sometimes feel like. If you're, you will be the piñata, and everybody around will have sticks that they want to beat you with. And that will happen. But in any event, I thank you so much, and I hate to talk in a room.
Well, Andy, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.